Well, the Obama birthers, the 9/11 truthers, and the moon landing deniers must merge their theories so we can have all the batshit in the same place. And then we'll take away your internet, so you'll have to communicate your theories the old-fashioned way by sitting on a park bench yelling at a pigeon.
Hello, everyone. You've just been listening to American political TV show host Bill Maher, and he's not the guest on today's podcast. I played this clip because in it, Bill is expressing the fairly common contempt towards views of the world that are often labelled conspiracy theories. The ability people possess to write off entire perspectives on the world prior to investigation has always fascinated me, because I don't seem to have it very much myself. I've never had that sense of certainty that the world works in a certain way and not in another certain way. It's always appeared as very mysterious and unknown to me. Therefore, when I hear people express contempt for certain positions, I always really want to know how they arrived there. How did they get that level of certainty? Now, I'm not concerned with 2 out of the 3 issues that Bill cited as examples of lunacy, but I would like to focus in on the 9/11 truth one. Ever since the day itself, I've been fascinated by the idea that the events of September 11th were perpetuated by elements within the US government. More than that, I've been fascinated by the divide between those who, upon investigation, feel this becomes obviously the case, and those who feel no investigation is necessary, it's obviously not the case. Having suffered derision for simply asking the question myself, I've been interested in how society derides and writes off anyone off this perspective. I've always felt they deserved, at the very least, a fair trial, to have their case judged the same way we would judge any case if it fell into a more conventional worldview. And that's what I'm planning to do in what will hopefully be a series of interviews, looking at how people came to have radically different views on the world we live in. Can these views be taken seriously? Or should such people really be screaming at pigeons in the park? My guest today is Dr. Richard Ellefritz. Dr. Ellefritz is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of the Bahamas. Several years ago, he completed his PhD thesis on the discourse within the 9/11 truth movement. He did that whilst being a part of the truth movement himself. In this interview, I ask him about his research into the truth movement, but I start by asking about his own journey with 9/11 and how he came to hold the kind of views derided by Bill Maher.
With the namesake 9/11, it started where it started with everybody else on September 11th, 2001. I was driving on my way to high school. I thought it was some ridiculous stunt that the local radio station was pulling. I changed the station. It was the same story. I got to school. There were TVs on in every classroom, and people were just in shock and grief-stricken and bewilderment. And I, was kind of like everybody else, and I just listened to the news. Didn't know much about history, world history, politics, or anything like that at the time. Took everybody's word for it. I do remember one time asking one of my teachers about the Pentagon. I said, why aren't more people focusing on the Pentagon? Why is it all the Twin Towers? And I remember being kind of shamed, like being directed to focus on the Twin Towers for some reason. And this isn't like a teacher who's, like in the New World Order cabal or something like that. It's just one of my teachers. And for the reason I kind of bring this up is because it's sort of representative of, society's institutions and how they guide what you think about and thus they guide what you talk about. And so I got my draft card in the mail, my selective service card in the mail 2 weeks later. And of course, this is when the drums for the Afghan war were just, beating full force. And
just for the European audience, what the draft card, is that something everyone gets in the US?
Well, at least males, and
okay.
At least at the time that I turned 18. So I turned 18 2 weeks after September 11, and you get a selective service card, which basically is a draft card. They'll draft you into the military, that you have to voluntarily sign. But if you don't sign it, you don't get like federal aid for like student loans. So that really kind of put the world into perspective for me. You know, the next year, when I was a college freshman, I think in March, I was watching on TV as Iraq was being bombed. I've always been somewhat anti-war, and so I remember being upset, but not too upset, because I was fairly disconnected from that aspect of the world. I was a college student. I was studying psychology and sociology at the time. And like my sociology professors would, you know, show documentaries like Michael Moore, you know, his films like Roger and Me or something like that. Mm-hmm. And I can't remember if I watched Fahrenheit 9/11 in a classroom, but I did watch it. I do remember when I watched it some years later when I was working on my master's in sociology, that I remember like I was pretty disgusted with the insinuation that George Bush had anything to do with allowing 9/11 to happen, which is a pretty strong underlying insinuation in Fahrenheit 9/11. So like the origins of my dissertation really came after that, when I overheard a couple of my professors, my major professors, talking about this documentary Zeitgeist. Mm-hmm. And so I was basically sitting on a bench, eavesdropping on a conversation, and I figured that, well, if it's good enough for these professors, it's good enough for me. And I had access to the internet at my office, and so I watched it on the clock. I don't mind a minute. Illinois can come after me if they want, but if you've ever watched Zeitgeist, it's pretty slow at first, and you know I mean, it's very polemic and like, you know, heterodoxic with the first clip or the first scene when it's talking about religion, and then it goes into 9/11. I was just utterly confused. Like, what does one thing have to do with the other? And what really caught my attention was the clip of Stephen Jones talking about the third tower that collapsed.
Just say who Stephen Jones is, please. He's one of the scientists for 9/11 Truth, isn't he? He's an engineer or an architect, or?
Stephen Jones is a physicist who worked at Brigham Young University in Utah, and he's kind of famous for working with other physicists and chemists around the world, like Niels Harrit, on papers that indicate that there were explosive material found in the dust samples from the World Trade Center complex.
Sorry to break. Please carry on.
Well, another point of interest for Stephen Jones is that he came under a lot of political pressure and was eventually fired, which is something that I had to take into account when I was working on my dissertation, because I knew at that time that people like Kevin Barrett and Stephen Jones had lost their jobs. And so I knew that going into it, I was jeopardizing my career. But, you know, like with the origins of that study, it really kind of goes back to learning about World Trade Center Building 7. Mm-hmm. And I mean, just learning about it, not analyzing its collapse or anything like that, because at the time I had completed most of my master's work. I think I was in my last semester. I considered myself a fairly educated, informed, smart person. So why didn't I know about this, right? And there's kind of a couple there's a lot of different explanations, but basically you can say, well, the reason that you didn't know about it is because it's not important. If it were important, the news media would have reported on it, and it would have been a fact as relevant and known as the collapse of the Twin Towers, et cetera. Or the other reason that, you know, you can say I didn't know about it, and that a lot of people don't know about the third tower that collapsed on September 11th, 2001, is because it's suppressed information. And it was certainly suppressed in the 9/11 Commission report. Its collapse was never mentioned. They wanted to wait until until it was studied by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And sort of along those lines, I remember in 2008, when I moved down to Oklahoma to start my PhD program, I had the internet in my home for the first time. And so I had watched Zeitgeist, and I looked up other documentaries. And And I remember I was watching a lot of C-SPAN at the time because over the summer, I just happened to catch Dennis Kucinich on C-SPAN reading 35 articles of impeachment against the Bush and Cheney administration. And this is during the 2008 presidential campaign where the Democrats and Republicans were just kind of all out, battling for the presidency. And, here's this presidential candidate, a representative, Dennis Kucinich, reading articles of impeachment. I was just becoming politically aware, and so I was consuming as much information as I could. And I had a couple of weeks before I started my PhD program, and really kind of had nothing to do because I didn't know anybody. And so I just watched, all the documentaries and video clips on YouTube that I could, but I was also watching C-SPAN a lot simultaneously. And I remember watching live the director or the head of the NIST investigation into World Trade Center 7, I believe his name's pronounced Shyam Sunder, explaining that the collapse, which I had come to understand was only really logically explainable by a controlled demolition. He was explaining that it collapsed due to normal office fires. And, this kind of really led to a sense of just, there's a term that we have in sociology called recreancy, and recreancy means a loss of trust in social institutions. So, when you find out a pertinent piece of information that has sort of evaded public discourse, such as the collapse of a third tower that was not hit by an airplane, and then you listen to the government explanation saying that for the first time in history, a building's fully symmetrically, uniformly collapsed.
Yeah.
That leads to the sense of recreancy. So
sure. I could just interject there for a second, just in case anyone has managed to not see this over the past 17 years. I'll put a link in below, and I would advise pausing this discussion and watching the 30-second video on the collapse of Building 7. I might be able to graft it over on YouTube, because no one really denies that it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, and it would be just idiotic, really, to deny that it looks exactly like that. But the National Institutes and Standards and Technology came back and said, well, yes, it looks like, maybe it does look like it, but it was office fires that brought it down. I think they rejected even the idea that it was structural damage from falling debris from the Twin Towers. But you see this perfectly symmetrical collapse brought about apparently by fires, right? So and that's not congruent with what the eye is telling you. And it's also not congruent with, I think it's up to 3,000 now, architects and engineers have signed a petition saying there's no way that could have been brought down by fires. There must have been some sort of controlled demolition involved. So just to give the people that context. Now, at that moment for you then, you talk about losing faith in societal institutions. I've met people, a lot of people, for whom seeing Building 7 come down has just completely rewritten their view of the world in an instant. Because people are on a spectrum of that, but particularly myself, just prior to 9/11, my vision of the United States was Hulk Hogan and Coca-Cola. That's the image we grew up believing, and it was about freedom, and they went to Iraq in the 90s to fight for freedom, and I believed all that as a teenager. But I was starting to see a darker vision just prior to 9/11. And at the other end of that spectrum, you have people who have maybe been involved in researching the Kennedy assassination onwards and all sorts of geopolitical history, for whom it was no surprise to consider that it could be an inside job. It was a natural conclusion they drew on the day that the US government was prepping its population for some kind of foreign war. But for you, this was a big shock, I take it. This was a big turning point and destroyed your vision of how you felt the United States worked on some level.
Well, I had already earned a bachelor's and master's in sociology, which does a pretty good job at, let's say, shifting one's paradigm regarding how we conceptualize what the United States is and what it does, what its history is. Sociology is a good discipline for giving one the ability to critically reflect upon a society's culture, government, economy, military, religion. And so I think maybe for me it was just sort of the sense that it's far worse than any of my professors ever indicated. You know, and these are people who I trusted to inform me. And at the time that I was learning about this, I had started my PhD program, and I would bring up kind of little factoids, and I would literally be shushed by, you know, a couple of professors, like the hand waving, oh, that's the Bush New World Order Trilateral Commission, Council on Foreign Relations conspiracy theory stuff. And I had never been called a conspiracy theorist in my life. I was fairly like apolitical. I mean, I wasn't apathetic because I voted and whatnot, but you know, I really kind of took issue with being called a conspiracy theorist, because what I was citing was documented facts. Because if you listen to or watch if you listen to quote unquote conspiracy theorists, you know, watch their documentaries, a lot of times they'll say, don't trust me, do your own research. And that's something that fit very well with my educational background, because one thing that you're trained to do as a scientist is to do your own research. In fact, it's a requisite aspect of becoming a scientist, that you are familiar with the body of literature, that you cite fact-based, evidence-based material, that you draw logical conclusions. And having spent 7 years now studying the 9/11 truth movement, I can say a couple things. One is that I think that at heart it is a science fact-based movement. And how I reached that conclusion is that, like myself, many of the people that I interviewed and that I study have almost a singular focus on World Trade Center Building 7. That event, or anomaly to the official authorized account, is responsible for the shift in worldview for many of the people that I've studied. And in fact, it's so important that, was it 2015 when I went back to Manhattan for my third round of data collection? So I went 3 times to Manhattan on September 11th, 2011, 2013, 2015.
Okay.
And last year I went to Washington, D.C. Instead of Manhattan.
And that's because there are protests going on there from the Truth Movement, particularly on September 11th, right? So you went to interview members of the Truth Movement. And did you meet people who are opposed to the Truth Movement too?
You know, that's interesting. I have yet to encounter in the field, that's what we call, you know, going out and collecting data like this. I've yet to encounter people who are vocally opposed to it, as in the types of people that are called debunkers, or as I like to call them, deniers. I'm looking forward to it. I have encountered them several times online, because I've also studied the 9/11 Truth Movement Facebook group. And if anybody in your audience wants to, they can join, and they can look me up there and have a conversation with me and anybody else in that group. But there was a conference going on at a hotel on September 11th. I believe it was the 11th. And then the next day, Architects for Engineers, and then also the Andy Steele from 9/11 Prefall, were organizing the dissemination of literature regarding the proposal for the Bobby McIlvaine Investigation Act. And so I actually participated in that by distributing literature to congressmen and women, or at least their staffers. And that's an ongoing effort. So sort of just to kind of back up a little bit, two things kind of are going on here. One is that my project eventually materialized into a concern with how the conspiracy label or the conspiracy meme functions to limit the boundaries of permissible discourse. And then two is that, you know, as I was being trained to be a social scientist and a critical sociologist, I very intentionally evolved my research from a more, if one could say, objective standpoint to a more activist standpoint. So that was actually something that I thought out ahead of time, because upon my first return from New York in 2011, I sat down and did a debriefing with my major professor, and you know, I basically, you know, was very emotionally upset. In fact, I had just an interesting anecdote. I got off the bus, I went to campus, I had to teach that day, and I had to go into a learning services office, and there was Dick Cheney on The View talking about the fact that he had just had a heart transplant. And so I had just come back from the field having interviewed 35 plus people who are saying that this person is directly responsible for, example, giving a stand down order for the flight that was coming into the Pentagon, if not responsible for other aspects of the ensuing war on terror, such as the no big contracts that Halliburton got and things like that. And I mean, this was just kind of like, you know, something that set me into turmoil. And so I'm having this debriefing with my mentor, and basically it came to light that, well, I'm gonna have to make a choice. I'm either gonna have to commit to this project or not, or treat it sort of with a less than rigorous attitude and effort, which is not acceptable. So with a topic like this and with an issue like this, it must be treated with rigor. And one of the things that I found while doing my research is that I had to read a lot about conspiracy theory, and I had to read a lot about it from psychology journals and political science journals and sociology journals. And I found that almost by a matter of routine, the scholarly work that has been done by 9/11 Truth members, such as David Ray Griffin, Stephen Jones, Neil Terrett, it's either not treated at all, which is called silencing, or ignorance. They're ignoring it completely. Or when it's cited, it's sort of cited with this eschewing of, well, at base it's conspiracy theory, so we don't need to treat it seriously or rigorously. And the people who do, people like Michael Shermer and Jonathan Kay and folks like that will sort of selectively choose what it is that they're going to address. And having read several of the books and watched all the documentaries and being familiar with the work, I know what's being left out, and I know what is,
sure.
And I know the spin that's being put on the material. So in my doctoral work, I studied the movement counter-movement dynamics by doing a critical analysis of the literature produced on conspiracy theories related to 9/11.
The very term conspiracy theory, I believe it started to appear in the media sometime after the Kennedy assassination, and it's documented that it was put there, introduced by the CIA through its connections to the media. Can you speak to that and how it's used to shame and shut down conversation? In that there's an implication that if you're a conspiracy theorist, it's like saying you're not a very clear thinker, you get caught up in fantasies, you don't understand the way the world works. These are kind of the implications of the term.
Yep. So actually, I just very recently was on a panel in Seville, Spain at the World Congress on Middle Eastern Studies. And the panel is made up of a working group on propaganda and the war on terror. And so the paper that I co-authored is titled Conspiracy Theory and the War on Terror. And what we did was looked at the CIA dispatch 1035-960, which is the document you're referring to, that sort of, the way I would describe it to be a little bit accurate is to say it initiated the popularization of the conspiracy meme as a pejorative. So that's, I think, an accurate way of describing it, because there are, quote unquote debunkers. Again, I call them deniers because I think it's more accurate. They'll say things like, well, no, the term appeared in literature well before the 1960s. Well, yes, that's true, but what we're concerned about is the rise in popularity of the use of the conspiracy label or meme as a pejorative, as a way to stigmatize, marginalize, or exclude people as the capital O others, right? Those are the other people that we know that they're bad. And in sociology, what this labeling process does is it sets up boundaries for what's considered to be normative and acceptable and deviant and unacceptable. And so this operates behaviorally. I mean, we don't accept murder except when the state does it, but we don't call it murder in that case, right? So the words that we use to identify and categorize the world around us and other people are important. And so that the discourse, which includes images and texts and words and phrases and meanings and symbols, shapes our understanding of the world and sort of what we consider to be allowable speech or permissible, acceptable, or even excusable. So, for example, in my dissertation, I discussed the idea that you can espouse the theory that 19 Muslim, Islamist, jihadist, Arab, Middle Eastern hijacker terrorists, right? And that's all supposed to be one unified concept in the public mind. I mean, you're almost, but by the way that the sort of Orientalism and mass media regarding the Middle East portrays this group, it's almost a monolithic thing that, you're supposed to hate and dread and fear. I mean, that's the point of terrorist and the terrorist label. So you can espouse that, and you can say, you can even say stuff like the Twin Towers collapsed, due to the pancaking of the floors, which is even dismissed by popular mechanics and FEMA and NIST as not true. And you can get away with it. And people might correct you on the physics, but as long as you don't say something like controlled demolition or something like that, you're in safe territory. So, for example, even Thomas Keane and Lee Hamilton, in I forget the title of their book, said that the commission was set up to fail. So they're allowed to say this, but if you say this and you question more aspects of their final report, which I think was basically authorized by Philip Zelikow, whose previous work was studying the generation and maintenance of public myths of all.
And he's very close to the Bush administration. So
right, and I'm coming back around to the CIA dispatch. So there's degrees of sort of safeness or safety when discussing 9/11 or other historically significant events like the JFK assassination, even up to the known lie of WMD in Iraq. So there are degrees of sort of appropriateness or inappropriateness that are generated, I think, from this particular dispatch. Again, that's CA dispatch number 1035-960, which basically set out, and this is language coming from this memo, that propaganda assets in the mass media were being guided and directed to use certain forms of logic, such as that these quote unquote conspiracy theorists, they latch onto a theory that they fall in love with, and they don't really provide any new meaningful evidence. And besides that, the type of massive conspiracy theory that they're proposing wouldn't be possible in the United States because it would be exposed. And for example, in one of my recent posts in the 9/11 Truth Movement Facebook group, which is an ongoing online ethnography that I'm doing, I posted about a conversation I had with a friend who used that logic, and the logic is carried on in several of these anti-conspiracist texts and by psychologists, political scientists, philosophers, journalists that basically say, besides just being a radical departure from reality, our functioning news press would expose such a conspiracy were it true. And then what gets used oftentimes is Watergate and the Iran-Contra affair. That there's a Woodward and Bernstein out there just waiting to blow the lid off this. So why aren't they? And there's explanations for that. So for example, if just at the broadest macro cultural level, if there is a general ignorance of anomalies such as the collapse of World Trade Center 7, then many people don't have cause to question the official authorized account to begin with. And so they just buy into the story sincerely. There could be other people who do know of such things, but also accept the official account, or maybe they're even skeptical of the official account, but they know that they operate in a culture in which it's illegitimate to question that account. And so none of this actually requires like this concerted global conspiracy. It just says that what the CIA did in that dispatch was to set a cultural meme or this idea, this belief system that was supposed to diffuse throughout society by the way of what they call propaganda assets. And so, what I was saying is that like we can have these broad macro level explanations that don't sort of play into what the anti-conspiracists want to say is this global meta narrative, because one of their arguments is to say, well, what conspiracy theorists have to do is constantly add on layer upon layer upon layer of the conspiracy, because it's kind of like in their mind, it's kind of like a lie, right? Like when you tell a lie, you have to cover it up with 6 or 7, more lies. So the idea here is that, well, if the media didn't report on World Trade Center 7, if it was left out of the 9/11 Commission report, if it was misreported by NIST, that implicates so many social actors that it necessitates a global conspiracy, or one of those people would have blown the whistle by now. Like some insider, would have been morally courageous enough to blow the whistle. And since they haven't, which there's actually just a extensive list of whistleblowers who are routinely ignored and shamed and stigmatized and silenced in other regards, that again, there would have been a whistleblower by now. So these are the tactics used by anti-conspiracists that sort of fall in line with the generation of the conspiracy label or the conspiracy meme, and it's carried out in society's dominant institutions of mass media, of academia, of education in general. If you look at history textbooks, they treat the events of September 11th very much in accordance with the 9/11 Commission report. And so I think, what one of my goals is to use a logic that doesn't fit with what these anti-conspiracists say conspiracy theorists use, which is to implicate intentional human action with malevolent intent. And this is the way that conspiracy theorists are routinely defined as a conspiracy theory is a belief that an event was caused by a malevolent group of secretive actors or something like that. And I don't think we need to use that definition. I think that's a definition that's intended to propagate the conspiracy theory meme as a pejorative. I think a better way of thinking about conspiracy theories is the idea that police detectives, prosecutors, and even jurors have to be conspiracy theorists from time to time when conspiracy is a criminal charge brought up, for example, drug rings, prostitution rings, money laundering cases. They have to theorize about a crime that may or may not have been committed in whole or in part, or with an entire network of people knowing every aspect of the operation or something like that. And this leads me into one more thing, and then I'll stop on this rant. Here's another logic that anti-conspiracists want to enter into the thing. And this kind of fits with what I was saying before. Such an operation would be impossible to carry out because you can't carry out such a large-scale, historically significant operation because there would have been a whistleblower, and again, there are extensive amounts of whistleblowers with 9/11. But B, like nobody can keep that secret, and it's such a complex task and organization that it's just impossible to pull off. In which, the kind of response that I found in my participants is no, the invasion of Normandy, the Manhattan Project, the stealth bomber program, the NSA surveillance program. I mean, these were large-scale secretive programs that were compartmentalized and operated on a need-to-know basis. And even high-ranking officers and officials were unaware of some of these programs, in part or in total. So,
well, let me push back a bit there, because I think I can recognize that some of the people who are writing about conspiracy in a pejorative way are acting in bad faith, okay? And I'm thinking of people like Michael Shermer, right, the editor of Skeptical Inquirer, who I don't trust at all. I don't think he acts in an honest manner. I think that's demonstrable from a lot of his work around 9/11 and the psychical research investigations. But I can understand people in the general population who are maybe working 35, 40 hours a week, hearing these kind of arguments that are making a lot of sense, okay, in that even if there is good evidential reasons on the day for thinking something fishy went on with 9/11, you could say, okay, well, maybe it's that the Bush government was involved in a cover-up about not seeing the warning signs, okay, because it seems too far-fetched to say they would be involved in it. And this was a problem for me too, because as I mentioned, my worldview of America was Hulk Hogan and Coca-Cola. It was this, so this is completely incongruent with what I previously knew. And I think that to accept ideas, we have to have a framework to put them in. And I didn't, right? Now, I could go to select then a kind of fanciful framework about Illuminati groups going back to ancient Babylon and coming from other dimensions and all this kind of thing, a kind of very grandiose conspiracy to fit this in. But I've no reason to believe that's true, right? It's just a fanciful notion of the world until I, derived evidence for it. So for me, an important part of the process in coming to understand 9/11 was looking at maybe the previous 100 years of similar events going on a smaller scale, going back to the bombing of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, which probably most people haven't heard of. But essentially, the USS Maine was a US warship that sailed into Havana Harbor in Cuba and just spontaneously blew up. The Spanish were blamed, and this led to really substantial wars with the Spanish and ultimately an invasion of the Philippines, and at the minimum hundreds of thousands of people died in that. And that's down the memory hole now. And what we do know for certain is that it wasn't a mine, the coal bunker exploded, maybe. It was an internal explosion, certainly. But the United States media at the time jumped right on it as an excuse for this war with Spain, okay? And then you see that repeating in incidences that everyone knows about, like with the Lusitania, with Pearl Harbor, slightly less well-known, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which sparked the Vietnam War. You see all these very dodgy incidents going on that spark major wars, and the media have an instantaneous response to them, which is pro-war and pro-the government position, almost as if it was set up to go. They're never properly investigated. And then when you look back, you're left to wonder, well, gee, did that coal bunker just randomly explode on that ship? Or did someone light the spark maybe? And was it all that accident going on in the Gulf of Tonkin that they thought they were being attacked and they weren't? Or was it a deliberate lie? And then you come to 9/11 and you see, okay, this event does not just spring from Dick Cheney and George Bush getting into power and saying, what we should do in September. There's actually a 100-year history and more of this. And that it was that rewriting of context. And I wonder how you would speak to that, maybe in yourself and also in the people you interviewed. And then they must have gone through a similar rewriting of their worldview. And I think for some people, on encountering things like the very direct visual evidence of Building 7 collapsing, they reject it and say, no, I've heard people say things like, well, I think I've seen a video from another angle where it doesn't look like this. Now, as far as I'm aware, there is no video from any other angle, but I've heard people directly tell themselves that story.
Oh, yeah.
Almost because it is so incongruent with their worldview that they reject what's right in their eyes, because a bit like, you could think of, the stories you hear about Galileo dropping the two balls off the building and them hitting on the ground at the same time, and people didn't see it. They saw them hitting differently because that's what Aristotle said should happen, and that had been around for 2,000 years at that point. So how did you find the reshaping of worldview, and how do you see that as being necessary to communicating about these kind of events?
Yeah, so there's a lot going on there. I recommend a lecture by Michael Parenti called Lies, War, and Empire. The first 10 minutes of it, he sort of lays out his philosophy of how worldviews operate, and he writes about this, and I cite it in my work. I think he cites Upton, or quotes not Upton, Walter Lipsett, somebody who says, we don't see first and then define, we define and then we see. And then he goes on to talk about how even our mental selectors, sort of our cognitive categories, they're not personal to us. they're formed through years and years and years of socialization into the various communities and social institutions that guide our lives. And if you think about it, if you are raised in an environment in which people pretty much talk about the same or similar things, sports and whatever's on the news media and popular movies and music, it's all fairly benign in context of what we might consider to be the world around us having readjusted our worldview. But even in popular culture, I mean, the Transformer movies are essentially movies about aliens building the pyramids, and about the moon landing being about going up there to visit aliens. One of the new Star Trek movies involved a false flag operation to start a war with the Klingons. At one time I had a whole list of these types of conspiratorial things. So you mentioned, Remember the Maine and the Lusitania, right, and Pearl Harbor and the Gulf of Tonkin, and then you have Watergate and the Iran-Contra. You have the Kuwaiti girl saying that the Iraqis threw the babies out of the incubators, and you have Clinton's wag the dog stuff with was it Bosnia or Yugoslavia, et cetera. The stolen elections in 2004, as far as Lance DeHaven-Smith is concerned. And I bring up his name because he has a very good book on conspiracy theory in America, and he has a series of articles where he deals with the SCAD concept. So SCAD stands for State Crimes Against Democracy. So I think that a lot of people are engendered with this, essentially uncontested concept of democracy. I mean, basically it can mean whatever you want it to mean. I see my progressive friends saying our democracy is in peril. And I'm like, aren't you the same person who thinks that the elections are tampered and stolen? And I was like, and furthermore, it's like we're a constitutional republic. And furthermore, after that, the Alien and Sedition Act basically abridged the First Amendment by making it illegal to criticize certain members of the government. And kind of going back to the Constitution in that era, the Declaration of Independence was a conspiratorial document. It basically said that the crowned government of Great Britain was conspiring against the let's say democratic order of the colonies. So is the Magna Carta, and you can go deeper into history than that. Judas conspired with the Romans to assassinate Jesus, right? Julius Caesar was assassinated by one of his close friends who conspired with members of the Senate. Like people like Michael Shermer, and really kind of he needs to be called out specifically, and I kind of wish I would have treated him in more depth in my own work. He has this fallback position. He sort of falls back on this idea that, the exemplar conspiracy is the attempted assassination of Franz Ferdinand, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And he said, and he gives this sort of elaborate explanation that, it was supposed to be this concerted effort, and it failed because, because of this guy Roche, R-O-C-H-E, Roche's law, that those who can conspire don't have the time, and those who do conspire are incompetent, right? And that's the logic that we're supposed to abide by. That our betters, the elite, they've got better things to do than to spend their time sitting around a smoky room hashing out plans, like the DoD does, and with the wars throughout the Middle East that General Wesley Clark said would happen and are happening across multiple administrations.
Yeah.
So Michael Shermer likes to say things like, that's how a conspiracy happens. It's messy. And then, one only has to remember the conspiracy to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. Something like, 7 or 8 people were hung in that conspiracy trial. And it's like, okay, so Shermer, if the standard for conspiracy is the attempted assassination of Franz Ferdinand or the messiness of that, then how did John Wilkes Booth and company almost overthrow that elected government, right? And I bring up that term "elected" on purpose to kind of draw back to this idea of democracy and the state crimes against democracy. So one of the things that Michael Parenti does in that speech in Lies, War, and Empire is he talks about what the state is. Or actually, I think that might be in another speech of his called "The Gangster Nature of the State." And he uses a definition of the state by classic sociologist, my favorite sociologist, Max Weber. And so what Weber defined the state as is that institution in society that has a legitimate monopoly over the use of force and violence. And the operative word in that is legitimate. And one thing that that people like Michael Shermer, you know, and I mentioned him before, Jonathan Kay, and all of these anti-conspiracists try to do is delegitimate those of us who latch on to what they call kernels of truth. So the anti-conspiracists like to say that, well, you know, there's always a kernel of truth at the heart of any good conspiracy theory. And the problem with conspiracy theorists is that they just don't know how to properly analyze it because they're epistemologically flawed. They have a flawed worldview. And, you know, thankfully, luckily for you know, we conspiracy theorists, they're here to help us correct that worldview. And actually what their job is to do is to legitimate the dominant institutions in society. So you sort of have the, you know, the idea that anything that's legitimate first has to be legitimated. So you have generations of people who have gone through public education systems, in which case these are essentially government workers using government approved textbooks to teach the history of government. And as James Lowen, a sort of a famous sociologist, wrote in his book, Lies Your Teacher Told You, in which he did a content analysis of widely used history textbooks in school. The history of the United States that's taught to Americans is basically the history of the federal government and basically the history of the executive branch of the federal government. And it's also closely tied to the militaristic efforts of the executive branch of the federal government. So it sort of solidifies a worldview that the great men of history are those presidents, you know, who had to, with moral fortitude and certitude, fight these wars that was protecting the beacon of democracy, the light of hope, the John Winthrop sort of idea of what the United States is. You know, and then you kind of set that alongside Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. And, you know, you just learn that there is just atrocity after atrocity after atrocity, oftentimes committed by the government. The difference between the government and the state is that, you know, the idea that, you know, a corporation could become the state if people legitimated the monopoly of the initiation of force and violence with it. So if we all decided that Walmart served or Amazon served our best interests and should be in charge of security, they could become the state. So government and the state are two different things. But right now, government is the state, and within it, people like Peter Dale Scott and others believe that there's a deep state. So this would be a network of rogue, you know, intelligence agents and actors, and, you know, probably double agents and moles and patsies and, you know, informants and these types of things, who operate within and among and between U.S. and foreign military and intelligence and governmental and media agencies. And the deep state, which kind of is a popular buzz term now, but there's a very good conference put on in 2010 by a group of scholars, including Peter Dale Scott and Michael Parenti and others. I think your audience can look it up. It's called the Deep State Conference. It's very good. So that predates the popularization nowadays, which I think is sort of obfuscating the idea of
sure, but Peter Dale Scott's been writing about the deep state concept for many, many years now. In a way, it's going to be quite different to what you're seeing appearing in the popular media now.
Yeah, and so, you know, people like him and David Ray Griffin, you know, they're among our aged wise men in society. You know, I think for me that's a fair appraisal. They have a perspective on history, let's say. So, like for example, you know, I was giving my story about, you know, where I was and when 9/11 happened. I have students, and I've had students for a few years now, who were toddlers and not even born when it happened, and so their entire concept of it is what they hear through word of mouth, mass media, and education. And it's largely comprised of narratives that correspond with the official authorized versions that an innocent nation was surprise attacked by the enemy of freedom and democracy, and, you know, et cetera. And so, you know, this kind of solidifies a worldview that says, well, if I do come across an anomalous piece of data or evidence or event it can best be interpreted as either unnoteworthy because it's not discussed often or ever, or there's some benign explanation, right? So there's no malevolence in human history, because again, the history of conspiracies throughout human civilization are treated as stochastic events, as sort of separate stochastic events. Because if you were to say, and I'll give you just a clear example, if you were to say that there were some network or some sort of operation going on where there was a transmission of knowledge or information throughout the last couple thousand years, let's say, that led to a variety of assassinations and historically significant events, you're sort of going down the Dan Brown path of Da Vinci Code, right? And when that came out, if you remember, I mean, it was just demonized and laughed at, and it's like the X-Files. It sort of gets used to eschew you from the legitimate public discourse that the sort of agenda setters want you to have. And when I refer to agenda setters, these are people like, again, Jonathan Kay and Matt Taibbi and Matthew Gray, these sort of scholars and journalists who will just outright say that they believe that they should be the ones setting the agenda. They want the editorial control over what the public discusses. And so just kind of wrapping this up, that kernel of truth that David Chandler, a retired high school physics teacher who actually studied in I can't remember where, but prestigious schools and had high marks, well qualified. He forced NIST to admit that World Trade Center 7 collapsed at free fall acceleration for 2.5 seconds.
Yeah, I recall his work. Yeah,
means that there was no supporting structure on the inside. And along with that, with the material gathered by researchers that show that there was, explosive residue found in the dust, which was not studied. I mean, basically the official explanation is they found no evidence. Well, they found no evidence because they didn't look for the evidence, because they decided already that the buildings didn't collapse from explosives, so they didn't need to look for it. And in my opinion, that's not a rigorous way or a legitimate way of engaging in research. I mean, you would be hard pressed to pass any of my courses if you brought that attitude towards studying material and as one of my students. So, just last word. And so when people look at these events, if their worldview corresponds to the narrative set forth by society's dominant and legitimate institutions, then they'll go through what psychologists refer to as cognitive dissonance. So they'll have two competing or contradictory ideas, and they're either going to have to change their mind and worldview, which is very difficult because you have to accept the implications that the world is even more dangerous. It's even more threatening, which many of my participants described when they had their conversion experience. They were anxious, they were depressed, they were fearful, they lost sleep, they lost their appetite. They had disruptions in their social lives, in their work lives, in their marriages. And so one of the things that anti-conspiracists want to say is that we feel safer with the idea that there are people who are so powerful and so in control that they can pull off these events and cover them up and make them happen. And it's just such a logical contradiction, but actually my data with my participants contradicts that logic, right? So that's sort of my my answer, because like I said, there's a lot going on in your statement.
Sure, and I want to ask you also about proximity, right? Because I don't think that people have a massive problem with thinking that maybe Nero burned Rome. Okay, 2,000 years ago, Nero was a known dictator. In the same way, we don't have a problem thinking that Iranians maybe forged their elections, or when there were the bombings of the tower blocks in Russia to justify their military incursions back a few years ago, and the FSB seemed to be closely linked to it. No one in the West had a problem believing this is something Russian state security and the Kremlin would get involved in. And equally, I think, if, let's say, North Korea, or people can put the dictatorship they like in there, if we saw a 47-story building collapse into its own footprint because of fire, and then the North Korean government saying this was terrorists from South Korea and using it as a justification for war and increased domestic oppression, I don't think there's a single journalist in the US who would have a problem critiquing that narrative and saying, look, clearly a fire did not cause a building to fall into its own footprint. Clearly this is exactly the kind of thing an oppressive dictatorship would say to justify the actions it wanted to take out domestically and engaging in war. And I don't think anyone would have a problem really seeing that clearly and objectively, but when it gets closer to home, almost in the way we can see problems of other people on an individual level we might not see in ourselves.
Yeah. Can I address that real quick?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I was just discussing one of the very popular explanations for why people cannot or will not entertain or accept these quote unquote conspiracy theories, and that's cognitive dissonance, right? So this is a very popular way to explain it. I think what else is going on speaks to a sociological social psychology theory called social structure and personality. So you mentioned proximity, and proximity is one of the key aspects of this theory. So like how close in your social network or how close in time, is an actual event or process, right? And then the sort of structural aspect is like what is it in society? Is it your friends and family? Is it an enemy? Is it is it society's dominant social institutions, which are family, religion, education, government, the economy, military, mass media? So when we think about kind of going back to people sort of having an objective appraisal, I really think that that's so difficult that we're people equipped to give objective appraisals of reality. We wouldn't need science because we would already have an accurate perception of what it is that's going on around us. But our human empirical faculties are so flawed that we need a rigorous and systematic method of collecting data, analyzing the data, and reporting the results publicly. I mean, when science was first being established, it was actually debated whether or not it should take place behind closed doors or out in the public. So we're people equipped to give objective appraisals. We wouldn't need science. Richard Gage is, as I think, shown that the official investigations by FEMA and NIST were not engaged in scientifically. That kind of stuff. So just kind of getting back to this worldview thing, there's another aspect that's important, and it's identity. Okay, so you mentioned proximity. I'd be interested to know the differences between, let's say, various generations of Americans as compared to various generations of Europeans, Middle Easterners, Asians, Africans, and do this broad study of, what are the sort of perspectives of those who believe and disbelieve in the official authorized account. And that's just me speaking as a sociologist, right? So that's the structural aspect. What are the age differences, but what are the nationality differences? Because if you weren't born and bred in the United States, being taught how glorious it was that Columbus discovered America, right, which is just a falsity, that the genocide of the Native Americans is largely underplayed. Things of that nature. I mean, there are aspects of United States history which one can latch onto and say, well, it's genocide of the Native Americans, the enslavement of Africans and others, Jim Crow, the internment of the Japanese, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the various wars. But I think that the function of the U.S. educational and media systems are to legitimate in the minds of people their identification with the federal government. So when you go to school in the United States, you pledge the allegiance to the federal flag, right? So not like your state flag or anything like this. You're all across the United States, right? Millions of small impressionable children who haven't even crossed the threshold of logical reasoning, of Piaget's concrete operational states. They haven't even achieved it, and they're being taught to recite this pledge of allegiance, right, to a symbol. And so it sets in the minds of these people an identification of nationality, right, of being a citizen. And so when somebody says 9/11 was an inside job, one of the responses is, you think our government would do such a thing to us? And, it's like, okay, like thinking of it as quote unquote our government is one thing, because again, you can think of it as the government, right? And that it's not representative of American society. I mean, there's far more millionaires in Congress than there are proportionally in American society. It's far more white, it's far more male, it's far more aged. So you see, you're taught in the educational system that you're an American, and America is largely a force for good, and then a lot of the atrocities are silenced or obfuscated, and then you go to a sporting event. I was just at a Cubs game at Wrigley Field in Chicago, and they were telling people to stand and rise to sing the national anthem, and they had military people there, and I'm like, and I felt like I was the only one sitting through that, and because I've kind of reached this point in my political philosophy where I'll think for myself, and I'll choose what I believe and say and think and do, and so you have the militarization and the Americanization of the NFL, of Major League Baseball, right? And that's why one of the big controversies recently was the football players kneeling during the national anthem, right? Because they're supposed to be this symbiotic relationship between these institutions, whereas in reality, I mean, this is sports, and that's government, and one's a private function, one's a public function, et cetera. And so again, I'm coming back around to this idea of identity, that some people just have such a hard time because they can't. It's like when they can't separate themselves from the institutions that we're saying are responsible for the event and the cover-up. So it's like when a new human is born, and when they're developing into about the first year of their life, they identify like as their primary caretakers, as their significant others. And so this is why it's kind of traumatic for infants and toddlers to be separated from mom or dad or whomever's taking care of them, because that is them for for all intents and purposes. And so when people say when we attacked Iraq, right, or when they attacked us, what they're doing is they're identifying with these dominant institutions as sort of an extension of themselves, or as themselves as an extension of it. And so it's threatening to their core identity that the society that has clothed them and fed them and nurtured them and provided the opportunities, and that kind of stuff, is also the same organization that's responsible for committing one of the worst atrocities, certainly of the 21st century, but the last 100 years. And just to kind of carry that analogy forward, well, okay, but these are probably people who they might debate the ethical nature of spanking, or as a libertarian might say, hitting children. And so just think about it. Well, a lot of people's parents, who are their loving caretakers who provide everything for them, are also the parents who use corporal punishment as a behavioral strategy to get their kids to obey their authority. They accept the fact that some authority members in society use violence to gain compliance and obedience to authority. I mean, you think about what law enforcement is, and that is the extension of government that uses violence that is monopolized by the state. And so this is kind of something that I think escapes most people's conscious awareness. But the core idea is that if what the state is, and it's currently occupied by government, if what the state is essentially a violent institution, why would the state sort of not see violence as a method to gain what is at the interest of certain actors in the state? So you have for example, the document Project for the New American Century. It outright states that the members of it, the Project for the New American Century, the members of it went on to become the Bush administration in one form or another. And they say, we need a self-inflicted wound. We need a new Pearl Harbor to meet our objectives. So they just outright say this, right? And And it's like, if you have an understanding of Pearl Harbor as being a surprise attack on an innocent nation that's the beacon and hope and light in the world for democracy, then you have a very different interpretation of what it means when these state actors say, we need something like a new Pearl Harbor. Because for people like, I think you and I, that have an understanding of Pearl Harbor as an event that was that was let to was allowed to manifest itself, you think, okay, so maybe these people are waiting for the opportunity, right? This is what's called the lie hop theory, the let it happen on purpose. And most members of the 9/11 Truth movement get past this theory pretty quickly, because how did Al Qaeda rig the explosives in the 3 World Trade Centers? How and why did Al Qaeda confiscate the video images from around the Pentagon?
It's almost a psychological middle ground that you, even though it doesn't make sense, it doesn't make any sense to the let it happen theory. It's almost a psychological middle ground people have to go to in between.
Yeah, and like I said at the beginning of this conversation, there are varying degrees of acceptability and unacceptability when it comes to 9/11 discourse. And those of us who really kind of fixate and latch onto the so-called kernel of truth that is the collapse of World Trade Center 7, right? We've all of a sudden crossed over into unacceptable discourse and will be called conspiracy theorists. And that was really what disturbed me about the reality that I had entered into, is that I could not have conversations about factual incidences in a logically, empirically verifiable way without somebody, saying something like, "Oh, that's conspiracy theory." I mean, this happens as a matter of routine because I am somewhat of an activist in this regard. Or saying, "You think our government, right, would do this?" And I'm like, with that response, I'm like, yeah, Congress held special committee sessions and voted on it, and the president signed it, and the Supreme Court authorized it. I'm like, yeah, our government. And that's just this kind of like fuzzy way of thinking about reality, and it's what Michael Parenti calls stochastic thinking. That sort of things just happen. And Lance deHaven-Smith, again in his book, when he discusses SCADs and the nature of state crimes against democracy, focuses on this, that these events are identifiable because they're sort of always treated in isolation. Like you're not supposed to think about the connection between JFK and the 9/11 events. One thing in my data that I found is that older participants in my research tended to say, well, I was suspicious of those events on September 11 because I had already studied the JFK assassination. And so I had learned already to distrust government. The younger participants are the ones who rely upon the anomalies and inductive reasoning based upon their observations, which totally puts a hole in the anti-conspiracist logic that we're all just a bunch of anti-authority skeptics who are epistemologically flawed, and we latch onto a theory that we love and then we build up from there. And my data completely contradicts that.
That's completely congruent with my anecdotal experience, that people who had lived through the Kennedy assassination and the Vietnam War were much more comfortable thinking that the US government engaged in both conspiracy and atrocity. And people I spoke to like that often had a much easier time straight away seeing that this was not what the story they were being told it was on 9/11. Like a final question I'd like to ask. Actually, I've got two. I want to slip another one in, really, to do with the concept of motive, because I think it's something that we find difficult with our own government, because we're presented the view that their motive is to go to work of a day for our betterment. Okay, they go to their jobs and they look after our security, and they figure out what the best education system for us is and how to manage our healthcare and all the rest. And we don't think of them as having a separate agenda. And this was something that, again, I struggled with. And one of the things that I think really helped was I read a history of the philosophy of Zionism and the coming into being of the State of Israel. Because what you clearly have there is a very ideologically motivated government, where you have this idea of Zionism, the political Zionism, that the Jewish people should have their homeland. And it starts off as an idea in the 19th century of no backing, really going around looking for financial support. And then 50 years later, they have a nation state, and it all goes from there. And along the way, people in support of that ideology were prepared to commit atrocities and false flag terrorism, like in the King David Hotel bombing in the 50s, in support of the ideology, because that's the principal ideology. That's what's the most important thing. And when reading about this, I thought, gee, it's, nation states and these kind of ideologies are in many ways similar to religious cults, okay? So you have something like Scientology, where people are prepared to go out and tell barefaced lies to a camera about what's going on behind closed doors in Scientology or a whole array of other cults, because they feel that they are acting in support of some idea that is absolutely essential to the survival of humanity. And with 9/11, I've tried to peg it onto a particular idea. So for a few years, I was very influenced by the work of Michael C. Rupert and his ideas on peak oil. Okay, the reason the Bush government did it is because they felt their backs were utterly to the wall, because the world's about to run out of oil and we need to take control of the world's oil reserves and supplies. And I thought, okay, yeah, that makes sense if there was that kind of desperation motivating them. And that one kind of fell apart for me, because we're nearly 20 years on now. We're past the date all this peak oil stuff was meant to happen. And I think if you look at the underpinning economics, it doesn't really make sense. It doesn't explain the world as we've seen it over the past couple of decades. So then I've been left to wonder at motivation again and speculate about that. What do you have any sense of a motivating ideology that would inspire whoever the conspirators are, let's say the Dick Cheneys and the like, as to what would inspire to take this incredible risk of pulling off this event? Is that something that you've contemplated?
Sure. And just kind of the qualifier that you use, this incredible risk. I'm not sure that it was an incredible risk.
That's an interesting point.
These are people who run the world, some of the world's major corporations, Halliburton, for example, and come to occupy the highest seats of power and orchestrate wars of aggression with impunity. I mean, these are people who maintain their wealth and power. They're very successful people. One of the criticisms of George Bush is that he was so stupid, and this is coming from Michael Parenti, but I buy into it. Is that, because he's dyslexic or appears to be dyslexic and that kind of stuff, he's so dumb. So this goes into the incompetency theory. He's so dumb, he would have been incompetent, and I was like, well, yeah, he was sitting in that classroom, and there's a couple of interpretations that you can have of when he was told about the event. Is like, one is, haha, the plan is going, swimmingly, and I have orchestrated everything very carefully. Another one is, oh no, like, holy cow, this is actually going to happen, right? Like being told this and like, okay, play my part, just sit here in action because, other people have to carry out their stuff. Or you can take the conventional view and just say he's dumb and incompetent and didn't know what to do and didn't do the right thing. And this sort of operates within this left-right paradigm. I run a Facebook group called Hegelian Dialectics and the false left-right paradigm, because I really think that kind of like Jesse Ventura used to say, Democrats and Republicans really kind of play for the same team. You can look at their corporate donors, and yeah, it's, some candidates and parties receive more or less money from others, but it's a lot of corporate sponsorship, and they get corporate airtime. The presidential debates are limited to the two main parties, and the issues are, should we bomb all the Middle Eastern countries, or just the ones that the Democrats say are, bad countries? And so yeah. When Republicans are in office, the Democrats are the heroes. When the Democrats are in office, the Republicans are heroes. And this is largely due to identity politics and people thinking of themselves as in terms of groups, right? So so when it comes to motives, there's different ways to sort of categorize the network of individuals, groups, organizations, and institutions that materialize these sort of historical events. And again, you have to think about this in a very complex way, because society, social reality itself is very complex. There's a lot of moving parts, and I think there is real conflict. I mean, I wouldn't go so far as to say that, for example, Trump and Clinton colluded for Trump to win the presidency.
Yeah.
I think that they really, tooth and claw, and certainly people are, engaging in, Russophobia, or however that's pronounced, tend to be the Democrats. The Republicans are, slowly but surely, or altogether, all out, getting on board with the Trump GOP.
Sure. Yeah, Mike Rupert gave the analogy of it's like different mafia gangs have competition to the point where they're killing each other, but they all band round the code of omerta when it's threatened from the outside.
Yeah, and I think part of how this works. Okay, so I want to be very careful, because I sort of want to identify the different ways of looking at this. And so let's just start with I'll sort of use Sam Harris's method, which is you start with the most extreme worst example and you back your way from there. So, right, the most extreme, example, I think, is like David Icke's, the universe is a hologram and we're ruled by reptilian overlords and, things like that. And that fits into Karl Popper's unfalsifiability problem with conspiracy theories, is that you really can't falsify that, because if there really are shape-shifting lizards, then, how would you ever know, type of thing. And if they're that powerful, if they're aliens, how would you know? Kind of scooting up, forward, you have the Knights Templar, Freemason, Illuminati worldview, which says that this goes back to King Solomon, the Ark of the Covenant, the Holy Grail, the Catholic Church, and Adam Weishaupt's conspiracy to infiltrate the Freemasons. And the Freemasons at the time were conspiring against the crown, right? I mean, they were meeting in secret lodges, having secret conversations to engage in acts of terrorism against their own government. That's one way of looking at the U.S. Revolution. So those kind of explanations for the motivations really entertain what anti-conspiracists love to sort of fixate on, is that these epistemologically flawed worldviews that connect too many dots and make stuff up. But what I'm doing is I'm slipping further and further into actual history, right? I mean, the founding members of the U.S. were co-conspirators in a violent revolution, a violent overthrow of government. So you have like motivating factors, right? So one of the explanations that sort of goes back into deep history is the Rothschild banking group, that says that the Rothschilds essentially figured out how to profit from war and control of the banking system. And so the people sort of position the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers and other sort of captains of industry, what they'll call, quote unquote, bankster, the bankster type of globalists, as the real sort of eye at the top of the pyramid. So the on the back of US dollars, you have the official US seal, which is a Masonic symbol, right? I mean, this is just basic, empirically verifiable historical fact. It's just how you interpret these facts is really what's important. So when you ask me about what the motivations are, I'm like, well, okay, I think it's money. I think it's money and power and money, and it's the cyclical relationship. Now, are there these sort of deep history secret networks? Well, certainly, secret societies have existed throughout history and currently. In 2004, we witnessed two former fraternity members, brothers, I should say, of Skull and Bones at Yale, competing for the seat of the presidency against each other, with the loser in that race conceding to the victor before the votes had been fully tallied. Those types of things lead to this idea that, yeah, there's cross-party collusion, that there is some type of cooperation going on behind the scenes. Now, that's within the realm of politics. Certainly, there's cooperation between government and corporations. And this gets into C. Wright Mills' famous theory about the power elite. So what he did is he analyzed American central or core institutions. He said, look, the main seats of power exist within the economic sector, the political sector, and the military sector. And he referred to the power elite as that intersection of coinciding interests. And so I think the important word there is coinciding, or the coincidence of interests that exists among individuals who operate within the seats of power in organizations and institutions that have the ability to make historically significant events or happen, or to initiate, those processes. So, and like along those lines, people theorize about Woodrow's initiation of the Federal Reserve Bank. So there was a central bank whose charter was allowed to expire by Andrew Jackson, who had a couple of failed assassination attempts against his life. And people theorize about the Lincoln greenback dollars that he was printing and his assassination, and Kennedy's executive order, like 11,110 or something like that, which he was trying to mint money, and this competition between the centralized moneyed powers and the democratically elected representative order of government, right? So that's to say that maybe we really do have representatives that have the people's best interests in mind from time to time, and they go up against a moneyed power that has at its interest maintaining its monopoly over the currencies that people use, and so they get assassinated. This is a theory about Gaddafi. It's a theory about Saddam Hussein going off the gold standard, instead of decoupling from the dollar. I've heard that Russia is engaging in this, and that type of decoupling situation. So I think the main motivations are money and power, and also, you have ideology. You have some dogmatic ideologues who are beholden to their interests, and this you cross the taboo border when you mentioned Zionism, and you have people like Paul Wolfowitz, who I think it was Paul Wolfowitz, who had dual citizenship. You have Netanyahu going before Congress and pleading his case for the increase of U.S. tax dollars to, I think it's like $3.8 billion in aid to the Israelis. And the taboo is that, well, now if you mention Zionism, Zionists, Israelis, well, somebody eventually, and I can point this out in anti-conspiracist literature just to no end, will eventually say, well, you're probably anti-Semitic, or you have the worst case was this guy Chip Roulette in his monograph Toxic to Democracy, which is just this diatribe, poorly formed arguments against what he terms conspiracism. And you have to understand that term conspiracism has the word racism embedded right in it. So he actually indicted, I think it was Peter Dale Scott, as being supportive of anti-Semites because he once sat on a panel with a person who used to work for Lyndon LaRouche, who is accused of being an anti-Semite. And so you'll be, just kind of even mentioning anything close to Zionism, Israel, Mossad, you're gonna fall into somebody labeling you. And this goes back to kind of why or to the function of the popularization of the Holocaust in the American mind, right? I mean, it's like everybody has to know about the Holocaust and in some way, shape, or form, and it's kind of odd because it works in conjunction with the silencing or obfuscation of the genocides committed by the United States federal government. So if you're unaware of or you don't believe in that genocide was committed by the federal government, then when you think of genocide, you think of the Nazis, right? And you don't know that the Nazis were practicing eugenics that were being practiced in the United States before Germany practiced them. So you don't know this stuff. You are trained to think that the United States is a Christian nation, and that the Christian nation has to support the Jewish nation, and it's all just this sort of cognitive operation that relies upon compartmentalizing our worldview. And I think that once you start to like really kind of analyze what these institutions, like what is the federal government? Is that our government, like as speaking as an American, or is that an institution that's operated by people who are largely unlike myself? Like, I don't have a will to power like a lot of these people do. I'm not a millionaire like a lot of these people are, right? I don't have I don't have this Ivy League education like a lot of these people do. And I think that a lot of Americans are just trained to sort of ignore that or not even consider it, that they're so unlike the people operating the federal government that to identify with them is sort of to identify with a stranger, you know? So again, the kind of point of what I was saying is to say that, you know, we have to be careful in how we think about motivations and intent, because motivation and intent are sort of at the heart of conspiracy, right? But like any good detective will say, well, in order to analyze a crime, you have to know, what is it? Motive, opportunity, and intent, or something like that.
Yeah.
And yeah, and so it's like, well, what motive would let's just say the Bush administration have and let's just say allowing 9/11 to happen? And it's like, okay, well, as stated in his in people who were in his administration and their project for the New American Century, they wanted increased funding for the military. They wanted to expand their operations throughout the Middle East, et cetera, et cetera. And we've seen that across multiple administrations. And so that just goes back to my cooperation theory, that there is cooperation among administrations, and it probably has something to do with personnel who occupy positions that don't depend upon elections, right? So I think you know, that's pretty much my answer to that, because I really get kind of uncomfortable when we talk about motive and opportunity. But you know, basically it's money and power, militaristic expansionism, global hegemony. You just have to look to the work of Zbigniew Brzezinski's book, The Grand Chessboard, and Henry Kissinger's book, The New World Order. And they just say it. They did. I mean, in their works, they just come right out and say, like, here's what the United States empire needs to do. It needs to expand globally. It needs to gain global cultural, economic, and political hegemony.
Okay, thank you for that answer. I'll have one more question. Okay.
Okay.
Given all we've said on the psychological factors that maybe prevent people from seeing this, I want to be really precise in how I ask this. I don't want to ask how can the 9/11 truth movement bring more people around to its side, but rather what direction can we take to facilitate more people being able to really ask the question? Okay, because that would be my interest, because I don't want to present it in a way that I want people to reach a certain conclusion, but what I'm aware of is that there are psychological and cultural barriers to even objectively asking the question. The question could be around 9/11, or it could be around a different entry point to reassessing the fundamental nature of how our world is working. And I wonder what your thoughts are on how the movement has gone over the past 17 years, where we're at, and what the future looks like. And I know you have a Facebook page around, I think it draws on the philosophy of Mahatma Gandhi in connection to 9/11. So what do you make of that? What the future direction is?
Yeah, it's the 9/11 group that I started is really just for me and my close friends, but I've accepted people I don't know. It's called 9/11 Satyagraha, and so Mahatma Gandhi coined this term as sort of a peaceful means toward truth and justice, let's say. From several of the interviews that I did and observations that I made of members of the 9/11 Truth Movement, they say it's a movement for peace and justice, and truth is embedded right in the title. So I was trying to find a word that sort of encapsulated that. Little did I know there was like a 9/11 Satyagraha radio program or something like that already out there, but you know, great minds think alike. So, you know, people like that who start that radio station, people like Andy Steele who does 9/11 Free Fall, people like you who are doing this podcast and having me on, the street activists who are going to gather at the World Trade Center at 5:20 this year on September 11th, engage in a silent sit-in. People like Richard Gage and Kevin Ryan and David Ray Griffin, Peter Dale Scott, Niels Herrick, Kevin Barrett, Stephen Jones, even people like Christopher Bolin and Ryan Dawson, the administrators of the 9/11 Truth Movement Facebook group, and all the other people who have started blogs and websites and spent their time on it are each doing what they can do individually. And as a libertarian, and as even furthermore as an anarchist, I do see the world through the lens of individualism. So this is my sociological colleagues are just gonna have a field day with that. But I think we need to think of ourselves as individuals, because the more that we rely upon group level thinking and categorization, the easier it is to find divisive ways to divide and obstruct what we do. So, you get, and again, I don't think there's anything wrong with joining a social movement organization. Like, I'm a member of 9/11 Scholars for Truth and Justice, which had it split from 9/11 Scholars for Truth, because of one individual and maybe another one, claiming there were like mini nukes and,
right,
just ridiculous technologies, right? And so, there are individuals out there who are sort of poisoning the well or, muddying the waters. And what I do, and again, I'm trying to, just discuss what I do, is I take them head on. Yesterday, I spent several hours like arguing with people. I got blocked on Facebook by this one guy. You have to be very careful in your arguments. You got to record, take screenshots and things like this, because the truth operates in the light, right? And I think the more that information, the more data that we have to expose what is and what is not true, the more that we'll succeed. I mean, and this is the point of the 9/11 Truth Movement, going out there and putting a billboard across from the New York Times, and it says New York, it's interpolating New York Times. New York Times, did you know a third building collapsed on September 11th? And New York Times just ignores it. But you can interpret that as a failure, but really it's a sign of success, because it's proving our case that there is a blackout or a silencing effect going on in society. And I think the more that we can think clearly about sort of, those types of issues, the stronger our arguments will be. So one of the things that's going on in the 9/11 Truth Movement Facebook group is that for quite a while there were several people who were debunkers or deniers, just allowed to operate sort of rampantly, hijacking threads and obstructing discussions and discourse, and they'll be evasive and in their responses and just ignore certain statements and questions. And really, we got to hold their feet to the fire and take them to task. So that's what I do. I think that also what I do is that I think that we need to counter the anti-conspiracist propaganda and really think clearly about the conspiracy meme and conspiracy label that was set forth in the 60s by that CIA dispatch. Now, something that I would like to address sort of along those lines is the polarization that certain topics, like if you question whether or not a 757 hit the Pentagon, you run the risk of being called a no-planer, which is a pejorative term within the 9/11 Truth Movement. I mean, this isn't even talking about the public at large. I mean, this is just a division that's been created within the movement itself.
Well, there is this idea in the movement, the no-planers, the planes that hit the Twin Towers were holograms. Okay, and I think it's a very fringe kind of idea, right? So I'm just clarifying what no-planer refers to, because I think there's
that's what
I've never gone down the road of the Pentagon, because I've seen like the architects and engineers have focused their efforts on the Twin Towers. So that's what I've looked at. But I certainly see what people mean about the Pentagon, that it doesn't look like a plane hit it to the eye. I wouldn't go down that road because I don't see the same level of expert knowledge talking about the impact on the Pentagon. But
well, it's one of the main fault lines within the movement right now.
right.
And, you know, if you're paranoid and conspiratorial minded, you think that, well, it's a fault line by design. Paper by Cass Sunstein and Vermeulen, his co-author, called Conspiracy Theories, Causes and Cures, which David Ray Griffin responded to with an entire book called Cognitive Infiltration, which is a fantastic book. It was that article by Sunstein, who later became the information czar for Obama. Says that, well, one way to cure conspiracy theories in society is to encourage or incentivize people to infiltrate these groups and to disrupt them within. And so, you know, you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to you know, understand that that's a likely possibility, that there are not just trolls, like general antagonists who just want to, you know, muck up the waters, but that there are actual shills, disinformation agents, and
Sure.
you know, propagandists. And
we had a situation in the UK where the most prominent no-planer theorist of 9/11 was an ex-MI5 officer. You know, so was he really an ex-MI5 officer?
Yeah, and so you know, one of the things that I think can help the 9/11 truth movement is to keep talking, is to not let the obstructionists and the trolls, or, you know, anybody else win. I think that, you know, if your listeners go into the 9/11 Truth Movement Facebook group, they can look up how I operate, what I say. They can engage with me. I'm fine with that. So I think that we need to engage in what social theorist Jürgen Habermas called communicative action. We need a free market of ideas, you know, and maybe this is my libertarian sensibilities again, but we need a open public arena of discourse, and, you know, there are people who do that, like Richard Gage goes on speaking tours, and so Christopher Bolling goes on speaking tours, and whether or not you disagree with them in whole or in part, at least listen, think about it, do your own research, talk about it with with people who might be open to it. Stay calm, stay friendly, don't panic, don't despair.
I mean, it's amazing to me, as someone, I had my suspicions on the day. I remember seeing it on the television and just having this split in my mind of, I don't know what I'm looking at here. Am I looking at what I'm being told I'm looking at, or is this something different altogether? And also being having pejoratives used against me then when I brought it up in conversation, you know, in the ensuing months. To be sat here 17 years later now talking about it, and to have seen, I couldn't have imagined on the day that there would be an organization of thousands of architects and engineers spring up that would oppose the official narrative, and intelligence officers and pilots and firemen and all the other range of people who have stood in opposition to it, and the documentary films that have been made where this is like a global movement. And, you know, because at the time it could have gone a different way, right? I think often you hear pessimism expressed within the movement because no one's been prosecuted, it's not a majority opinion, the younger generation don't have the same kind of memory of it as people of our age do and upwards. But this is something that could have all very easily been swept under the carpet, and there could be no substantial counterpoint views on it now at all. And it's only for these movements and the people that have made documentaries about it that it's out there. And I take a lot of heart from that as we sit here in 2018.
Well, and this is a matter of deep contention for anti-conspiracists. I mean, hardly any of these texts fails to mention that it's the rise of the internet that has led to the increased popularization of conspiracy theorizing. And they really lament the fact that they've lost control of the narrative. And when I say they, I mean, like, you have editors, journalists, academics, bloggers, you know, I mean, in the after the panel discussion in Seville a couple weeks ago, a anti-conspiracist 9/11 denier named Matthew Gray assailed me with a 5-minute diatribe of all the reasons that I'm a conspiracy theorist and that I'm wrong, and that, quote, I'm sailing dangerously close to his territory. And he was saying that, well, the danger of conspiracy theories to society is that they polarize people to the extremes and stop discussing what they ought to be discussing. And those are his words. You know, it really struck me. And I'm like, and do you think, and you know, and I'm like, do you think that you're the arbiter of public discourse, that you get to set the permissible boundaries? And they do. And there's a really good paper on the drama of conspiracy theories. I think it's like the dramaturgical analysis by Wexler and Havers. And they say, well, basically in the drama of conspiracy, there's two competing narratives. Like there's two different worldviews. And this is, I think, you know, the way I start my dissertation off, close to the beginning, I quote, I think, a passage from New York Times or maybe Time magazine, where the author of that passage says something like, you know, conspiracists and I forgot how we phrase it, but conspiracists and the public live in two very different worlds. Like, yeah, we do. We definitely live in two different worlds. And it's not like a metaphysical thing where, you know, we occupy different physical objective realities. We have different worldviews and different interpretive schema. And this is what's of concern to people like Matthew Gray and Matt Taibbi and Jonathan Kay and Michael Shermer and Rob Brotherton and Karen Woods and all these anti-conspiracists, is that the dominant narrative of history is being challenged. They're losing their dominant status or their legitimate, or their status of legitimacy, because people like you and I and many other members in the 9/11 Truth movement won't stop talking about it, won't stop raising what they call disturbing questions. And so this is one thing I did in my dissertation, is I focused on one logical aspect of their argument. They say, well, conspiracy theorists just rely on just raising questions or just asking questions. And I'm like, oh, that's really interesting, because scientists do that, journalists do that, detectives do that, prosecutors do that. Like we're an inquisitive species. You know, if there's sort of one thing you can rest your hat on in terms of human nature, is that we're a social species, so we don't like to be excluded or stigmatized or marginalized. We're also a symbolic species. We operate symbolically. Most of what we do is communicate with the use of verbal or other symbols. And you know, the dominant symbols, the American flag, Coca-Cola, you know, the McDonald's arches, you know, the military, they're losing their significant statuses because they're being challenged roundly with, you know, health concerns, with ecological concerns, with economic concerns, political concerns. And so this is a real danger to society's core institutions. There's a group called the Compact Group, and they're a group of European scholars who are funded to formulate anti-conspiracist discourse. So that, I mean, they're getting government funding to produce propaganda to maintain the legitimacy of society's core institutions by delegitimizing people who question those institutions and the veracity of the narratives that support them. So, you know, other groups do that too. Atheists do that. Anarchists do that. You know, and those are just the two main groups that I can think of that really challenge society's core institutions. And so you see like some of the same tactics, you know, that are used for example, like I studied climate change skepticism and the institutions that were responsible for generating that skepticism. Does that make sense? Like if you're skeptical of anthropogenic climate change, then you're probably relying upon some of the rhetoric and logic produced by the Cato Institute or something like that. So that actually gave me a really good framework for why it is that I ended up studying the competing discourse of the movement, counter-movement dynamics between truthers and deniers. And the reason that I actually used the 9/11 truthers is because that's the reason I used discourse among the truthers and deniers is because Among the Truthers was the title of Jonathan Kay's atrocious book, right, Among the Truthers. And so I embedded that in my title on purpose. Because people like him will just directly say that they're losing power to control the agenda setting function of the media, that this is a bad thing because like Chip Roulette says, it's toxic to democracy. People will stop voting. They're more likely to be skeptical of climate change. They won't vaccinate their children, and they're going to homeschool their children. And all of these things are kind of important issues, right? I mean, we would say that these are very important topics. Well, they're important partly because of the agenda that's been set within the educational and media institutions to promote these things as sort of unquestionable social norms and things that are designed to benefit the greater good. And again, when I said, you know, we need to be careful when we think of ourselves in terms of groups and categories, because it's easy to slip into this thing called democracy or the greater good, right? So democracy is 51% of people can take away the rights of the minority, and that's why we have a Bill of Rights in the Constitution, is to protect minority rights, to protect the smallest minority's rights as the individual. So then you have this, like, you know, John Stuart Mill utilitarian concept of the greater good, whatever that, like, well, what is the greater good? What's good? What is the greater good? Because I think that what's good is open and free discourse, being civil in our discussions and not name calling. Like I was scolded as a child for calling, you know, my siblings names, but now in public, it's completely acceptable for pundits and journalists and politicians to just call somebody a conspiracy theorist, right? And in this day and age, people are losing their jobs, their entire careers, for tweeting out statements that can just be interpreted or insinuated to have racist or sexist content. But they all get the public gets a free pass whenever they use this conspiracy theorist slur. And it's oftentimes without rigorously attending to the very good scholarship done by people like, again, David Ray Griffin. I think the rigor that Richard Gage has put into his work, Kevin Ryan, they don't attend to it with the same type of rigor that they expect us to attend to, you know, their sort of fanciful construction of what they consider a conspiracy theorist to be, which is just untrustworthy and out of line loudmouth, probably a hot pocket eating basement dweller, things like this, like all these like kind of bad things. And you'll see this in trope after trope in movies, right, and TV shows and in cartoons. And so, you know, the public gets a free pass when they denigrate, they delegitimize, and even demonize people who are raising some of the most important questions, I think, of contemporary society, which is, who can you trust?
Okay, thank you very much, Richard. I think we'll conclude it there, and I'll put links in to vast majority of what you've mentioned, particularly to link to the Collapse of Building 7 video, the short video, to a longer, I think there's an hour-long presentation by the architects and engineers. I'll link to the Facebook groups you mentioned and anything else.
Okay, yeah, if you want, I can send you some links, because I remember some of the lectures that I cited. I can send you links to those.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. Yeah. Any final words?
Any final words? Yeah, I think your last question is an important question, because I think that what the 9/11 Truth Movement is doing is historically significant in that it does and can and hopefully will lead to the establishment of actual truth, peace, and justice in the world.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me on.
Well, thank you for listening, everyone. I hope this will be the first of many interviews I'll do looking at people who hold radically different worldviews and asking the question, is it legitimate to do so or not? I'm personally not concerned or even that interested, actually, in what people's conclusions are as to whether which worldview is the correct one or if there is a correct one. But as to the question of legitimacy, my own assertion is that Bill Maher is quite wrong in suggesting the likes of Dr. Ellefritz should be shouting at pigeons in the park, and that we'd all do well to embrace a broadening of our minds to encompass these ideas. So thanks again for listening. And if you'd like to be kept informed of future interviews, you can either subscribe or subscribe to the newsletter linked just below.